Thank you all for joining us this evening for the Women's Equality in the federal election, Why Your Vote Counts. My name is Debbie Henry from Cowichan Tribes, Vancouver Island. I'm a director with Single Mothers Alliance, BC. Before I go any further, I wish to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded First Nations territories of the Coast Salish peoples, in particular, Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in Metro Vancouver. On those territories, we work, live, and play. I would like to read a short poem. Instructions for living. Friend, do it this way. That is, whatever you do in life, do the very best you can with both your heart and your mind. When one sits on the hoop of the people, one must be responsible because all the creation is related. The hurt of one is the hurt of all, and the honor of one is the honor of all, and whatever we do affects everything in the universe. Spoken wisdom by White Buffalo Calf Woman. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. I'm Camilla, and I'm here from the Single Mothers Alliance. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm one of the directors as well, and we're glad that we could all have this conversation tonight because it's crucial. The facts are the facts. Canada is no longer rated #1 on international gender equality indexes. In recent years, our rankings have fallen to between 18th and 23rd, according to the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. According to Stats Canada and recently leaked report from the Status of Women in Canada, the rates of male violence against women are not going down. 1 in 10 women in Canada lives in poverty. 1 in 4 single mothers live in poverty, and 1 in 3 Aboriginal women live in poverty. Women make 20% less than men for working the same hours and have hit a brick wall. The pay gap between men and women is twice the global average. 68% of women in the paid labor force have children under 6, but Canadian investment in childcare is about 1/2 of the OECD average. We have 25 female legislatures for every 75 male legislatures. So tonight, we are going to talk about how to change these facts. To begin, I'm pleased to introduce our mediator, Erica Johnson, an award-winning journalist and host of CBC's News Marketplace. Thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you, Camilla. I'm pleased to be here and I look forward to an exciting evening. As the mother of an 11-year-old daughter, however, I wish for a world in which events like tonight are not necessary because we have achieved women's equality. Yes, I am an optimist. We have lots of ground to cover, so here is a brief outline of how things are going to unfold tonight. We're joined tonight by candidates from 3 of the 4 major political parties. Each will have 2 minutes to outline what their party is doing or will do to support women's equality. It just so happens that all of these candidates are from the same riding, Vancouver Centre, but tonight is not a debate. It's an opportunity for you to hear what each party is offering as you head to the polls October 19th. So after we hear from them, we will hear from 3 panelists, activists, researchers, and experts in the field of women's equality. Then the candidates will be given an opportunity to respond to some of the issues that our panelists raise. After that, we'll move on to questions from the floor, and there will be volunteers from the Single Mothers Alliance circulating with microphones, so if you have a question, please just catch their attention, and we're going to try to squeeze in as many questions as we can tonight, so we're asking that you keep your questions to about 1 minute long. A last note, if you need bus tickets to cover the cost of transportation after the event, they're available from the Single Mothers Alliance. And if Melanie or Sherry could raise their hands, just seek them out. There they are way in the back. Find them and they'll be happy to provide you with bus tickets. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the panelists and the party representatives joining us tonight. Closest to me on your right, Hetty Fry from the Liberal Party of Canada, Constance Barnes with the New Democratic Party of Canada, and Lisa Barrett is with the Green Party of Canada. Unfortunately, we have no candidate from the Conservative Party. Minister Carrie Lynn Finlay had agreed to take part in tonight's discussion, but she cancelled 5 days ago, and the party has offered no replacement. Welcome to our candidates, and thank you for coming out this evening. On our panel tonight, we welcome Sheila Day, a women human rights expert who, amongst other things, appears before United Nations treaty bodies when they're examining Canada's compliance and its international human rights obligations. Sheila? You can see the back of her hand and her head. We'll see her later. Anglika Ivanova is a senior economist and public interest researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Welcome, Anglika. And Sherry Smiley of the Thompson and Navajo Nations is an artist, feminist activist, and nonprofit co-founder. Thank you very much for joining us. But we will begin this evening with a special presentation from Grace Lohr, a director with Equal Voice BC, on women's political participation in Canada.
Thanks so much to everybody for being here. I'm thrilled that we're having this discussion, and I'm thrilled to be here with both the panelists and the candidates. I just wanted to start out by giving you a little bit of a picture of how women are doing in this election. I am a director with Equal Voice. We're a multi-partisan organization dedicated to electing more women to office in Canada. So as Camilla pointed out, when Parliament dissolved just before the election, there was one for every single woman MP, there were 3 men. And it matters. It matters to politics and it matters to policy. It matters to how Canada looks. This is how the parties are standing. This Equal Voices update just came out today, so this is from last week. I'll point out that the Green Party now has about 36% women, but we can see the breakdown. Overall, we're sitting at about 32%, but it varies by party significantly. It's not that we're not improving, but we are improving so slow that it's going to take another 76 years at this rate to reach equality in terms of candidates, and that we're not even talking about elected MPs. It's been 95 years since white women in Canada got the right to vote, and it's only been 55 years since Indigenous women got the right to vote. It's been 95 years since women started running, and we still have 76 to go before we're looking at parity among candidates. So as you can see, we're sitting at 32% women among candidates in this election, and it's practically a rounding error from the 31 that we're at last election in 2011. Just for some context, this puts us at 49th in the world. We're behind diverse countries like Afghanistan, Rwanda, Sweden, New Zealand, the UK. I mean, there's 49. I could stand up here for a while and list the countries that we're behind. And we're not doing much very quickly to change that. There's significant variation by province. Newfoundland is at the top right now with 41%, and as nominations are closing this weekend, that won't change. Maybe we feel good about British Columbia sitting at 35%. Second highest province, right? We're above the national average, right? But that's well below what we might consider equality. Worse, It's down significantly from 2011. In 2011, 41% of candidates running in BC were women. So that's a significant step backwards. A much bigger step backwards than the step forward we're looking for nationally overall. There are some signs for hope, I think. This week's update from Equal Voice, we were able to take a look at Indigenous candidates running. And among the major three parties, women make up 50% of Indigenous candidates. That said, Indigenous women make up just 1.9% of all candidates. Among the major three parties, Indigenous women actually make up a greater percent of candidates than their representation in the population, which I think is grounds for hope. However, given the specific policy needs and the historical context, we need to do much better. Equal Voice this week was able to look at 33 key ridings where 50% of the population were visible minority, so I guess visible majority. And we wanted to see whether in these ridings the women were as diverse as the ridings they represent. And again, women do better among more diverse candidates. They make up 40% of diverse candidates in those ridings and only 20% of majority candidates. I think what this tells us is that when we do more, when we seek out qualified, capable leaders in our communities, and we seek out diverse people to be our representatives, to lead us in politics, we do better for all communities. These are some of my least favorite numbers. There are 98 ridings in the country, right? It still might change in 2 of them, but in 98 ridings, there is not a single woman running for the major 3 parties. There are 5 where there are no men, and actually, we're in one of them. More than that, there are 59 ridings. I think that's my next slide. Yes. There are 59 ridings where there is not a single woman running for any of the major 4 or 5 parties, so including the Bloc and the Green. There are 2 where there are no men, and we are in one of those ridings. Vancouver Centre and Brampton West are running all women, but in so many ridings, there is not even a woman on the ballot to cast a vote for. We can and must do better because it matters to politics. This is not just a numbers discussion. This is not symbolic. It's not some vague concept of democratic equality or justice, if that can be considered vague. It has consequences for the kinds of politics we have and the kinds of policy decisions that get made. So I will leave it there because I think what we're going to talk about tonight is some of those key issues that I think these numbers and the representation of women in politics matters for. So thank you.
Thank you, Grace. That's quite a picture you paint in terms of how few women are running in this federal election. So thank you to our candidates for stepping up. And in case you missed it, Equal Voice has a table in the back. They're doing outreach, so if you're interested in joining the Equal Voice debate or signing up for their newsletters, etc., their registration table is just in the back there. So now it's time for all 3 of our candidates to have a 2-minute and 2 to 3 minute introduction and perhaps to address some of what Grace has just mentioned. Earlier this evening, we drew names for the order, and we're going to rotate through the order, so you won't always be first, you won't always be last. If you are long, I will raise the red flag. This is your 15-second warning. So we're going to begin tonight with Hetty Fry of the Liberal Party of Canada. Hetty.
Good evening, everyone. And I see so many familiar faces, especially in the front row with Sheila Day, who have been fighting for women's equality for as long as I can remember, for as long as I've been a member of Parliament. And it seems to me that we have only moved forward to move backward. I recall in 1995 in Beijing, that was the first time that it was acknowledged that women's rights were human rights. Imagine that, 1995. we learned that women's rights were human rights. And we also talked in Cairo about the right in 1994 for women to have independent decision-making with regard to their sexual rights. That has been spoken about, and today I can go to international conferences and I see that being dragged off, dragged back. Women are not allowed to have independent reproductive rights anymore. Young women are not being taught about reproduction and about how they can make their own decisions and about birth control and about any of those things. I think for me, it's really sad because having been the Minister for Status of Women for 7 years under the Chrétien government, and having been there when Canada was #1 ranked in the world, and watching us now where we're 23rd in many of the gender equality, in any of the gender equality analyses. And I feel really sad. It just feels like everything that many of us have done. I don't know how Sheila feels, and I won't speak for her, but all the things that we have done over all these years have been for nothing. I'm going to speak about Canada. It was Canada who came to the Beijing Conference in 1995 and brought the concept of gender-based analysis. It was Canada who came to the Beijing Conference in 1995 and talked about a woman's right to choose and about how the lack of ability for women to have access to abortion around the world was a public health issue, and that if we had 350,000 women dying from a bacteria, we would be running around looking for a vaccine, but 390,000 women are dying from botched abortions around the world every single year, and nothing has been done about it. But Canada made it, at that time in Beijing, it's a public health issue, and we need to treat it as such. And so, for me, the whole concept of United Nations treaties and women's human rights, I believe that it's a sad day that we've rolled back. I have to suggest that this government, the Harper government, has been the cause for Canada falling so far down. I always think that this government seems to be having one goal, and it's just a race to the bottom. And we seem to be getting there very nicely, thank you, in every other indicator you can look at. Now, addressing women's poverty is really, really important, and I'm hoping later on we will get to talk about that, because at the heart of women's equality is the fact that women are poor. And of course, housing is a core component of women's human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hetty. Now let's hear from Constance Barnes of the NDP.
Great, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak tonight. Now, I'm actually going to do my best not to make this political at all, because as a single mother, as a mother who's been on welfare, as a mother who was in a very abusive situation and had to leave her husband and raise her children on her own, I believe that it's not all about politics. I think all my sisters here and all the sisters in this room have to come together, regardless of your political background, to make the change that needs to happen. We need to address poverty. We need to address violence against women. We need to address housing, affordability, childcare, the Aboriginal people that have been absolutely pushed aside. And for myself, I also want to talk about being elected. There is a time in my life, my kids are now 26 and 27 years old. There is a time in my life that there is no way in the world I would have thought that I would have been elected for 6 years at a municipal level. There is no way in the world when I was standing in the lineup at the welfare office with my son, J-Mo, and my daughter, Dylan, in a tandem stroller, trying to figure out how I was going to find somewhere to live, that I would ever think I would be where I am today. It is not easy. I have been there. I have survived it. I have come from a dark place. I was lucky that I had a family I could reach out to, although I will say that was one of the hardest things, is telling my family that one of the 5 daughters was being abused. It didn't start until I had children. So there was something that clicked in my partner that all of a sudden it became physical. So for me tonight, I thank the Single Mothers Alliance, and we'd had some great talks before, like it was months ago, before I said yes to speaking. And for me tonight, it's about what can we do as women to make change. I agree with Hetty that we are going backwards, But for me, I've survived it, and I'm here to talk about the fact you can survive it, you can come through, you can run, you can get elected, you can make a difference. And I've been there, and I want to speak to my history, and I want to make sure that I am working for all the women and the girls and the little bubbas that are out there that will come after me. So I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Constance. And now Lisa Barrett with the Green Party of Canada.
Thanks, Erica. And also I want to thank the organizers for this. I think it's a really important and timely event. My story is similar to Constance, a single mother, and had to have a restraining order on my ex. And there was so much that I learned, though, in the process of being very poor and having to go to a welfare office and having to see the look in people's eyes when you're given that little piece of paper that says you can get some groceries. It's horrible, it's humiliating, and people should not have to live like that. So what that did for me was provoke me to get even more political. And so I will be very political tonight. I grew up with a very political grandmother who was a CCF founding member and a member of Voice of Women for Peace. And she was very active and vocal and took me out when she was doing census enumerating so I could meet a lot of other people and learn about their circumstances and learn more about what other people's lives are like. And so I think that helped to inform me when I did encounter, difficulties in my life, to know that I'm not the only one. Lots of people struggle with these issues. We need to go deep and find out what are the roots of these issues, attack those roots, because it's going to continue. Unless we find the root causes and deal with those root causes in an effective and urgent way, we are going to perpetuate these cycles of poverty and violence and ongoing discrimination and colonialism. So I really believe that politics is where I'm best placed to make a difference, and so that's why I ran in federal election in 1997 with two very small children as a single mummy and just dragged them around to all of the all-candidates meetings. But now they're very political, and they're activists too. So I'm very proud of that. I think that we all have an opportunity to contribute and to make change, and I'm really interested in listening to the answers that we get, and more importantly, to the questions that are posed, so that we can all think a little bit more about what it is we can each contribute as women in our society.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa. Next, I'd like to welcome Sheila Day to the podium to address women's economic inequality.
Hi. I'm really glad to be here, and there are a lot of friends in the audience, and some people I don't know, but I'm really pleased to be here. And I would like to say my own personal thanks to the Single Mothers Alliance for doing this. I'm very, very impressed by their hard work and by their thoughtfulness about getting this event together. So thank you very much. While I'm very glad to be here, I'm also very sorry that I have to say the same things over again. Many of the same things that I feel as though I've been saying for the last, well, I don't even want to say how many years. So it's long. But I think what I'm here to do tonight is to give us what I think are very important baselines. So here we go. A strong and committed federal government is essential to achieving equality for women in Canada. The federal government needs to play a leadership role, not just by holding up women's equality as a value that Canada stands for, but by structuring programs, taxation, laws, and policies so that the distribution of resources and benefits advances women's equality. Strong social programs, including adequate social assistance, civil legal aid, childcare, healthcare, home care, and access to adequate affordable housing, create equality for women. Women are persistently poorer than men. Why? Because we're still the primary caregivers for the young, the old, and the ill, and we haven't yet figured out how not to penalize women because of that. Much of women's caregiving work is unpaid, And it limits women's availability for paid work. The lack of affordable, safe and childcare constrains women's choices, and in the paid labor force, women tend to be still in the caring occupations, which are paid less because it's women's work, and more likely to have part-time jobs with no job security and no benefits. Because of the tight connection between women's lives and various forms of caregiving, social programs play a central role for us. Programs like healthcare and childcare shift some of the burden of caregiving from the shoulders of women to the state. They make it more possible for women to go to work, to go to school, to be active in public life, and income security programs like unemployment insurance and social assistance soften our economic dependence on men. All of these are equality-creating programs. Historically, the federal government has played a central role in the creation and maintenance of national social programs through the use of its spending power. It has supported and set standards for programs delivered at the provincial and territorial level by transferring money designated for expenditure on certain social services and placing conditions on those transfers. So it's a simple fact that when the federal government backs away from a leading role in social policy, when it transfers money to the provinces and territories with no designations, and when through tax cuts it shrinks the revenue base that supports social programs, and that revenue base has been shrunk a huge amount over the last 10 years. Women are pushed backwards. Canada's dramatic fall on the UN Gender Equality Index is no surprise. So let's talk about poor women. The link between women's poverty and vulnerability to violence is now widely acknowledged. When women are poor, they're more likely to be coerced into sexually exploitive relationships with men, including prostitution. If they don't have adequate incomes, women cannot leave violent men because they cannot feed and house themselves and their children. We all know this. Yet welfare rates across the country for every household type fall well below the poverty line. The federal government no longer attaches conditions to its transfers to ensure that social assistance meets basic needs. It's not credible to say that we believe in ending violence against women when we're not prepared to provide women with social assistance that is above the poverty line. Canada has no national anti-poverty strategy, and the provinces and territories cannot end poverty alone. A national anti-poverty plan for Canada has been called for by a parliamentary committee, over 600 social justice groups, UN treaty bodies, the UN Human Rights Council, and thousands of Canadians. Canada Without Poverty has developed a detailed national anti-poverty plan for Canada that includes a national housing strategy. Canada's big city mayors and the Canadian Federation of Municipalities say that Canada has a housing and homelessness crisis because there is not enough affordable housing to either buy or rent. So, women have the right to equality, and the federal government has a key role to play in fulfilling the human rights of women. That means fulfilling women's right to an adequate standard of living and creating and maintaining the national social programs that will support and enhance our equality. What we want to hear is what your parties want to do to end women's equality deficit. Thanks.
Well, them's fighting words, I would say. All kinds of fantastic ideas. We're going to start with Constance Barnes, moving down the line. 2 minutes for an answer to this question that we'll ask you all to reply to. What strategies will your party employ to address poverty, and specifically the needs of poor women?
So the situation, as we've heard, is excuse me, really grim in Canada for women. We think that we're doing better, but we're actually not. And as been mentioned previously, we are 72 cents for every dollar a man makes, and that's been for the last 42 years. So we are definitely losing ground. And it's really hard to move forward when we keep going backwards. So a couple of the things that we do know, and I know I said I don't mean that I'm not making it political, because I am definitely here to support the NDP and Tom Mulcair in our strategy, but I just don't want to battle as in a debate. I think that we need to look at what we do moving forward. So we need, and I did see Sharon Gregson here somewhere who got me totally hooked, yay Sharon Gregson, on a national childcare strategy. So I've been on Joint Council of Childcare for 6 years and the Coalition of Childcare, and fought very long and hard for my 6 years at the Vancouver Park Board. So we need a national housing strategy, which needs to be brought back in. That was dissolved and pushed down to the provinces. So the provinces are now doing the best that they can do if it's a top of mind, and if not, it goes to the cities, and you're looking at mayor and council that are working on land swaps and that type of thing. So I would say the number one thing we need is a really good childcare, national childcare strategy. And we are proposing a $15 a day childcare strategy. And actually, if you look at Quebec, when Quebec brought their childcare in, it was 15% of poverty dropped within 2 years, and 70,000 women went back to work. So it works. And I'm thrilled that what we're in a position to do now is to bring in a $15 a day daycare plan, so that basically when the women are out there working, they're paying taxes, the taxes help to pay for the program, and they're also out there and they're able to feel good about themselves, and they're out there to be able to be a part of society. Thank you.
Lisa Barrett, how would you answer? What strategies will your party employ to address poverty, specifically the needs of poor women?
Well, we want to address the needs of all poor people, but specifically for women, the child care plan we believe is very important. Ours has a bit of a twist to it, though. We believe that working towards infrastructure all across Canada, so child care spaces are available where people need them, when they need them. And more, the precarious work also means shift work. And having a $15 a day child care program that only applies to those kind of places where you can drop your child off at 7:30 in the morning and pick them up at 5:30 at night doesn't work for a lot of people, especially low-income people who are struggling with 2 jobs sometimes at the same time, shifting between parents, sometimes picking them up. They need worksite childcare, and we need to work with the provinces and the cities to deliver that kind, to ensure that kind of childcare is available, and you can do that through a planning process and through, planning rules. The Green Party is proposing a Council of Canadian Governments to work through those kind of interjurisdictional programming that we really do have to have. We can't have this disjointed approach anymore. Underpinning all of this, though, to support everyone so that no one falls below the low-income cutoff, the Green Party is the only party proposing an annual, guaranteed, livable wage so that everyone can live in dignity, doesn't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from, if they're going to buy food, if they're going to pay their rent because their welfare check has just been totally used up on something that they didn't expect, like a dental emergency for their child. Another program that we're going to implement if we're elected, or if we have the influence to push through, is dental care for low-income children under 18 years of age. And that's something that has been called for a long time.
And lastly, Hetty, what would your party do?
Well,
to address
I
poverty?
think we know that women's poverty is linked inextricably to lack of good housing, lack of opportunity to get good training and to go to work, lack of childcare spaces. And so these are things that we all believe are very important. So we've talked about a national housing strategy that will address all the flexible needs of women. For senior women, we're talking about assisted living strategies if they're ill or if they're disabled. We're talking about affordable rental housing. We're looking at social housing. And we're also looking at the ability for many women to be able to afford a home in this terrible city of ours. So that's part of the broad spectrum, bringing back Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation into the system so that they can start building houses, building new units of houses, and working with co-ops to begin to maintain and build new homes. Housing is important, but I think the most important thing is that we have so many senior women living in poverty right now that one of the things that we plan to do is to stop the clawback of OAS and to look at increasing the GIS to about $940 a year or more, and that will lift by 2019 1.25 million senior women out of poverty, 900,000 of whom are single women, single senior women who are very much in poverty. So I think those are some of the things we want to do, but we need to talk about caregiving. Most senior women today are caregiving their senior husbands. They are not capable of doing it, so we need to look at healthcare, how we change healthcare, how we bring about a caregiver strategy, which I don't have time to go into detail, but a national caregiver strategy is there. Parental benefits, looking at how we allow for men and women to share a new expanded benefit that's 18 months, and they can take it not on a full 18 months, but whenever they specifically need it. And finally, one most important thing that we have to do is that a government has to be able to do gender-based analysis on every piece of legislation and every bit of policy we do to see how it will affect women and how it will affect men. Thank you.
And Hetty, just a point of clarification, because I'm looking for differences and similarities between each party. Just a quick yes or no. The other two parties are saying they support a federal childcare program. Yes or no for the Liberals?
Yes, we support a national childcare
Okay,
program, but
just
we
want
think
that on the record.
it has to be flexible. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Because as you heard Lisa say, and I agree with her, I've heard from a lot of women who want to work in the construction sector where they make good money, but it's shift work, they can't do it if they don't have some kind of flexible access to childcare. So this one-size-fits-all $15 based on the Quebec model is not necessarily
Okay,
going to
thank
work
you.
across this country.
Great. Question number 2. We're going to start with Lisa Barrett. What will your party do to address the current housing crisis in terms of how it affects women and women fleeing male violence?
Again, we also have a national housing strategy. Our housing strategy is different in that we're looking at the full spectrum of housing from a position that we've already been in before. The CMHC was wonderful when it had a full mandate to deliver all the housing within the spectrum of affordability. And so the range from social housing to cooperatives to more affordable housing that people might want to develop on their own through CMHC-backed funding, whether it was through their insurance programs or whether it was outright granting. So over the last 10 years, I think the funding peaked in about 2008 and has dropped off, and the funding through CMHC for cooperatives ends in 2016, so that it just drops right off. So those cooperatives, those wonderful cooperatives that many people have found themselves in, and are adhering to that maximum 30% of your income. It should be the most you pay on your housing. And we feel that that's very important. We need to get back to that. And the kind of market housing solution that it's been left to for and is being proposed to continue to be just generating the kind of housing that we need through market solutions, that's not going to work, because we need to take it out of the market and back into social policy, because housing is not a commodity, housing is a right.
And because you still have some remaining time, could you address the part of the question how your party would help women fleeing male violence?
I think that the national program for a guaranteed livable wage is the one thing that will help, because so many women are trapped in precarious positions, vulnerable, dangerous positions, because they have nowhere to go. And because the housing is so expensive, they cannot go, either, whether they're on their own or with children, especially taking children, to try to find a shelter in the city. I don't know if any of you have tried, but if you have children and trying to find a safe place to flee to with your children is nearly impossible. And I've had so many women, and also women who are in Oppenheimer Park, telling me about the difficulties they've had. It's not working.
Thank you. Hetty, if you could address this question, a lot of it you touched on in your first response, so maybe just drilling down a bit more on
On housing, I think we need to have shelters for women who are fleeing violence, safe and secure shelters, and then we need to look at first stage and second stage housing for them that is also safe and secure. And that had been started at one time, and it's now just died the death. And so I really think that many women are couch surfing. We don't even know that they're homeless because you're staying at somebody's house and staying at somebody's house. But the issue of fleeing violence means it has to be safe, it has to be secure, and nobody can find them. So there have to be some measure of confidentiality about at least immediate shelters, and then, of course, moving these women and their children to first and second stage housing. But I think the issue of violence against women has, as Sheila said, has to do with the fact that women are very dependent. If a woman doesn't have enough education, skills, and training and opportunity to work, she has to stay locked into a marriage or a relationship in which she doesn't have anything, doesn't know where to go with her kids. And so I think the government has a huge role to play in looking at that kind of housing that at least gives them somewhere to go. And I think, so that's where we feel it's really important.
Constance.
Thank you. So first off, I would say that we would start regarding violence to women with a national action plan addressed against violence in women. And it would start off with, again, looking at territories, provinces, working with municipalities, and bringing everybody together to have that discussion and figuring out what we need to do. I think housing is, again, a huge piece to this, and we need to make sure that all women and children are safe. In this riding alone, there's over 90 between co-ops and subsidized organizations, which will all lose their subsidies. It's actually as of 2017 under the Harper Conservatives. And I've knocked on many, many of the doors of these people, and it's heartbreaking to see the seniors and the veterans and the people that are living in these homes and the single moms that have no idea what they're going to do when the subsidies come about. So we worry about homeless now, and we worry about the people that we see on the streets now. There is no plan. There is no plan for where these folks will go. So we also, the NDP, will be bringing in a national housing strategy. We will maintain the existing housing that is happening already. We will maintain the subsidies that are happening at the co-ops, and we will build upon those structures and infrastructure that is already there. There's no reason to get rid of something that is actually working. We need to look at what's working, build on it, and grow with what that existing housing already is. So when it comes to women, they need to be safe. We need a safe place. So we will have a strategy to look at violence in women, and we will also have a housing strategy to make sure those two go together, because it is a right to have housing, and we need to make sure that these women are safe. We also need to make sure they have shelters and they have places to go when they need to make that move. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And just a reminder, if you don't feel that you're getting an answer that you are hoping for, or you'd like more information on something, make sure that you alert someone at the end of the session, and you can pose your own question to our candidates. Now let's hear from our second panelist, Iglika Ivanova, who is addressing a different aspect of economic inequality.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for hosting us, and thank you for all of you for coming tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share some of my research and thinking about the state of women in Canada, and also the role that public policy and government can play in kind of moving us forward towards greater equality. So let's start with the basic facts. In almost every industry, at every education level, whether we work part-time or full-time, women in Canada are still paid less than men. We heard a little bit about that, but Canada's gender pay gap is the 8th largest among OECD countries. Women working full-time, full year earn about 20% less on average than men. And that gap has narrowed by less than 2% over the last 20 years. So we made a lot of progress in the 80s and 90s, and then over the last 20 years, progress has really slowed down. Women of color, First Nations women, immigrant women, women with disabilities are even farther behind. And it's remarkable how little progress we've made basically since 2000. One of the big things that people don't realize is that public funding for research on gender equality has been cut sharply at government level, as federal level especially. The budget for the Status of Women Canada, the federal organization whose job it is to look at improving the lives of women, their budget has been cut sharply, and their mandate has been narrowed. We have seen the closure of many women's rights organizations. So I think it's important to realize that women's unequal place in the economy, and not just poverty, but basic inequality and gender gaps, are connected to all the other issues we're talking about. They're connected to violence, they're connected to not being able to get housing, they're connected to issues of human rights and freedoms. So it's essential to tackle these things together and not separately. And I think it's essential to start at the economic, place. And one of the big challenges I see today is that the barriers that hold women back in the economy are a lot less visible than they were 30 years ago. We tell our daughters that they can grow up to be anything. They can be astronauts, they can be scientists, they can be prime ministers. But we know how many prime ministers who are female Canada had, right? 1 for 5 months, less than 5 months. So we tell them that. And I'm probably the first generation of women who grew up hearing that. You can be anything, gender doesn't matter. And then we grow up and we see that we didn't become prime ministers and politicians and scientists and engineers. And what happened, and why is it that even in the areas where we work, we're less likely to get to decision-making positions or to management positions? And I think there are several reasons which are not as obvious as problems were 30 years ago, but they're very real. There's still actual sexism. There's still people who think that women are just secondary to men, that they're not as good at their jobs or they're not as smart. It's not polite to say it out loud in mixed company, but it exists. And that's something that we all need to fight within our families and with our friends. But the other big thing is what Sheila talked about, and it's the issue of caregiving. And whose responsibility is it to care for our society's children, for our elders, and those who are ill? And this is one where the federal government can do a lot about, and we talked a little bit about it, but I want to push into it a bit more because I really think it's connected to gender gaps in the economy overall. Because for a number of reasons, we still believe that caregiving is the job of women. And it's the unpaid job of women. And despite the fact that my generation is getting more education than men, actually, we continue to do twice as much unpaid caregiving work at home than our male peers. And that just purely by the fact that we all have 24 hours in the day. This leaves us less time to work in the paid workforce, less time to focus on our careers, less time to engage in our economy, and less time to run for office. So this is where I think it's important the federal government comes in. Social programs, they're absolutely essential to be able to equally participate, not just to not live in poverty, but to actually equally participate. And that's what we haven't been doing over the last 20 years. And that's what other countries that are doing better than us in all the global indices, that's what they're doing. What they're doing is affordable childcare. What they're doing is paid sick leave, which is something that we don't have mandated in Canada. What they're doing is paid vacation that is longer than Canada's mandated 2 weeks. And so these are the kind of things, including programs like home care that will help support those who care for the sick and the elderly. These are issues that will help women. And so the government has an important role to play here. And I think this is something that we're not doing. And when the federal government chooses to prioritize tax cuts, especially ones that go to higher income people, and we know the large majority of them are not women, when tax cuts are prioritized at the expense of social programs, this actually holds women back. And one more thing, and I'm very glad that the issue of gender-based analysis came up, because while I would like us all to work towards equality across all areas of the economy, the reality is that at the moment, women and men occupy very different sectors and very different places. And because this is a reality, I think our federal policies need to take into account that fact. So when our main job creation strategy is to boost the resource sector, or to boost infrastructure spending and construction, or to boost manufacturing, this is not gender neutral. These are sectors where men are a lot more likely to work. So we also need a jobs plan that boosts sectors where women work. And we can also use the federal government spending power or procurement power. So when there's large federal infrastructure projects, we can mandate that a certain share of the jobs go to underrepresented groups, go to First Nations, go to people of color, go to women. That is something the government can do. And so I want to finish by saying that I'm all for telling our daughters that the sky is the limit and they can grow up to be prime minister. But we need to put in place these kind of public policies if we actually don't want to be lying to them. Thank you.
I think I heard people asking, when are you running for office? Okay, so time for questions coming out of everything that Iglika covered, and there were a lot of issues. We know that women suffer economically when they take time off for motherhood. They have caregiving responsibilities. They often battle pay equity. There are gender-restricted job opportunities, so that's a lot of issues. What strategies, Hetty, does the Liberal Party have to fix any or all of those, if you can fit them in a minute 30? I'm shortening the time you guys have because I want to get through more.
Okay, I'm going to have to speak very quickly. But I think one of the first things that we're going to do is bring back real gender-based analysis. It isn't that gender-based analysis disappeared from the federal government. It was there, but nobody bothered to do it in their department. So we're making it happen. We're bringing it back. Because that's really, really important to look at jobs and the kinds of jobs that you can get. But flexible childcare is a really, really important piece if women want to go in shift work and some of that kind of work. But I really think there are a couple of other things that I wanted to point. Caregiving. Women carry the burden of caregiving. Women are now stuck between their kids and their parents, trying to take care of them. And I think we need to bring in, and we are bringing in, a strong caregiver program that will allow women not only to take time off to caregive, or men, but anybody can take time off to caregive, and they can do it in chunks. So they don't have to take one chunk of time and say, I could do 6 months and after that I can't get anything. And it shouldn't be taken out of their EI leave as well, because when they do really need EI leave, they can't get it because they use it up doing care. So we can take it in small amounts as needed, and also it's going to be available not just for the woman and the man in the family, but for anyone who becomes our new families, as we see now, neighbors or whomever. So that's a really important piece. Child benefit is really important, and also we have a child benefit package that we're bringing in that's going to be tax-free so that women can have that kind of money. But really the most important thing is the parental leave. And I think if we're going to increase parental leave to 18 months, and it's going to be taken by any of the two people who are the parents. And I don't even want to get into pay equity, and I cannot get into unpaid work, because we've talked a long, long time, and Sheila knows, about unpaid work and how women should be given money for unpaid work in our society, and they don't.
Thank you, Hetty. Constance, would you like to dive in with what the NDP would do?
Okay, so the first, excuse me, I'm really under the weather, so if people are like, what is the matter with their voice? It's because I'm not 100% today, but I did not want to miss this. One of the first things we would do, the NDP would do, is for those young students that are doing practicums, they get paid for them. No more free practicums, no more going in and working your butt off and working really hard. I know my son did that for quite some time, and he did not get paid. So with that also comes in the national childcare strategy. And I think even at $15 a day, there's always ways to work around it and make it work. And it works beautifully in Quebec, and I believe very strongly, I know strongly it can work here as well in BC. And the work that I've done and the people I've talked to, they'd be happy to be able to drop their children off before and after school care. Housing, making sure that we have affordable, accessible housing housing, continue with the co-ops and the subsidized housing that we have, and make sure that not only the women and the children, but our seniors and our veterans and people with disabilities and the LGBTQ and trans community are housed, and that we have shelters. The cuts to the shelters have been amazing. The cuts to the women's programming has been amazing over the last 10 years. We need to reinstate that. We need to look at the welfare rate. I know myself, I did the welfare rate and got on board with the welfare rates folks at Carnegie and did that for a week. I lived on $25 a week of food, trying to remind myself of what it was like when myself and my children were living that way. So we need to address the rates. We need to look at a $15 an hour minimum livable wage for people in Vancouver or in Canada, and that's what we'll do, and a little start of what we'll do. Thank you
very much. Lisa Barrett.
Well, personally, I think that we should first and foremost reinstate National Action Council on status of women and the tri-council agencies that were also cut. We don't have the research that would be telling us, and when we do find the research, when it's leaked, we find out that much of that information has been redacted by our own government that should be paying attention to the needs of women as it's reported. But when they cut the funding for the kind of research that would report that, we don't have anything to go on except, the kind of anecdotal stuff that we hear. We know that there's a problem, but we also know that there are solutions that have been proven around the world. Even here in Canada, in Dauphin, Manitoba, there was essentially the kind of program that we're advocating, the guaranteed livable wage that was given to everybody in that town, and the indicators, the quality of life and well-being indicators in that place skyrocketed. It was shown to work. Women could take time to be with their young children or as caregivers, as it does fall to them. The problem in a farming community it's very much split gender-wise because somebody is doing the very heavy labor. That was where they found that this program works really well and it can be applied all across this country.
Thank you for all your answers. Our next question, we're going to begin with Constance, and it is, women are overrepresented in precarious labor and part-time work, which means limited benefits, limited security. What is your party going to do to ensure that adequate social and economic protections are available to all Canadian workers?
Well, I actually, I want to I'm going to segue a little bit. I want to talk about something. I mean, number one, we need to make sure that all women are acknowledged, but there's one thing that I feel we have not touched on tonight, and that is our Aboriginal women. And I just want to talk.
Actually, there is a category coming up, so
Is there?
we will address
Specific
absolutely.
on Aboriginal women?
Yes.
Okay, so then we're going to, I'm sorry, the economics?
Yeah, what programs would your party put in place to ensure that there are adequate social and economic protections for women, for all Canadian workers? Because women often bear the brunt of part-time work or non-unionized work, that sort of thing.
I would say that, well, number one, we need to look at education, and we need to make sure that our women and our young girls feel comfortable and able to go into any school, any university, any college and feel educated. They also need to be able to afford it. So we're looking at affordability for young women and support. It seems, and it was interesting, I was at a tech event just a couple of days ago, and it was gaming. And there was about 78 men in this room, and tech, we know, is one of the new biggest things in Vancouver, Hootsuite and some of the gaming companies. There was 2 women there. And when I went and talked to the women there, they both said they actually did the marketing. They didn't do the gaming, they didn't do the tech work, they weren't there programming, they weren't working at the computers. They were brought in to do communications, and they were brought in to do marketing. So one of the things we would do is make sure that women had equal opportunity in the education system and make sure that they had a good, strong voice. And again, you look at the overarching an organization that comes together to work with young women and young girls to make sure that going forward we have the education that they need in universities and our colleges across the country.
Thank you very much. Heidi, what would your party do to ensure adequate social and economic protections are available, specifically for women?
Well, I think one of the things we want to look at is the issue of say, a good, solid, pensionable a pension plan for all Canadians, not just women. We need to make sure that people have the ability to have money to put aside. And so talking with provinces and territories and working on ways in which we can develop a pension plan that works for each of those provinces, the federal government comes in and puts money on the table to help to make that happen so that across the country women can have a good pensionable income. The other thing I think we want to talk about is women in precarious work, and you've talked about that. I mean, I think childcare is important for women and shift work, etc. So opening the door and access for women to take away the biggest problem that women have to deal with is children. And we still bear them. I'd love to find a way as a physician to get men to bear children occasionally. That might change things a lot. But I think the fact is that women bear children, and what happens is in the workplace, a woman will not get promotion. Even though she's bright and she started with the man when they didn't have children, he gets children and he gets to be a socially stable guy. She has kids and she gets to be a low productivity worker. And so we need to make sure that women can get that sort of CPP dropout where women can take a time off on in and off to have their kids and not lose their place and not lose their pensionable earnings. We need to look at something like that. But precarious work. I would like to see that this government paid attention to and will pay attention to the Bedford decision for women who are working in the sex trade, to make them safe and to keep them safe. Because right now that's the most precarious work that women do.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce our final panelist of the evening, Cherry Smiley. Oh, I'm so sorry. I skipped. You don't have the time. Go right ahead. I'm terribly sorry.
That's okay. Now I have to remember what the question was. I was moving on to the
what would your party do to, we've talked about how women tend to suffer when they take time off work, that they tend to have part-time jobs and so on. Are there any specific training programs in place, et cetera, that your party would implement?
Yes, definitely. And I would go back to the guaranteed livable wage, which takes a lot of pressure off people to work in those very precarious and vulnerable places, and the kind of jobs that just don't have any sort of job protection. You never have a union that's going to go to bat for you. But even when we do have unions going to bat for us for equal pay for equal work, that takes a long time. It spends a lot of money. We need legislation to legislate equal pay for equal work. We also need to invest in our education system, and the Green Party is proposing tuition-free post-secondary education by 2020 and capping student debt at $10,000 for existing student debt. So that way we get better educated people, especially, it is so discriminatory. The university system is so elitist and discriminatory these days. In order to get into a university, you have to have been planning well ahead to make sure you had a family that could afford to send you to university. And a lot of people didn't do that.
Thank you very much to all of you for those answers. And now it's time to hear from our final panelist, Cherry Smiley, who has flown in from Montreal to be with us this evening.
So I'd like to, of course, acknowledge the Coast Salish territories that we're on and to thank very much the Single Mothers Alliance for hosting this event. It's been a great success. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the evening. To thank all of you for being here. Male violence against women and girls is at crisis levels here in BC and across Canada, and it is something that can be prevented. Violence against women and girls is not inevitable and is not acceptable in any form, whether that be physical, emotional, or sexual violence, wife battery, incest, prostitution, pornography, or any of the other forms that male violence can take. Women in BC are being murdered by their male partners at startling rates. So far, 6 women have been murdered by their ex or current husbands or boyfriends this year alone, and the year isn't over yet. Rape crisis centers and battered women's shelters play vital roles in helping women to escape their abusive husbands and boyfriends, yet are grossly underfunded or receive no core funding at all. Many women and girls, myself included, have experienced male violence and turn to these women's centers and shelters for support and advocacy, or for help navigating the justice system. The justice system continues to fail women and girls when it comes to male violence, and as a result, Many women choose not to report attacks by men for fear they'll be blamed for the violence committed against them, for fear they'll be ignored, for fear they won't be believed, for fear that they won't be taken seriously. And usually they aren't. In order to escape or heal from violence, women need access to robustly funded, women-only shelters and rape crisis centers. And the justice system and our culture as a whole needs to hold men accountable for the violence they're choosing to commit. The poverty faced by women and girls also plays a role in increasing our vulnerability to violence, as we heard Sheila talk about earlier. Poverty narrows women's income and educational options and keeps us trapped in violent situations or relationships. Contrary to the messaging so deeply ingrained in the rape culture we live in, no woman or girl wants to be hurt or raped or abused. No woman or girl wants to be coerced to engage in sexual acts with numerous strangers night after night. The rape culture we live in extends beyond university campuses and touches all our lives. At the root of this culture is the false idea that women actually like it or that girls actually want it. In other words, this culture is rooted in male privilege and power and in a no means yes mantra when it comes to violence, rape and sexual assault, pornography and prostitution. If we lived in a country where women and girls had equal access to an income that allowed them to live above the poverty line and care for themselves, their children, and their families, if we lived in a country where women and girls were paid as much as men were for the same job, if we lived in a country where those living here were thought of as assets instead of liabilities, women and girls would have more freedom to choose our education and careers, more freedom to leave violent relationships or remain single if we so choose, and would have more freedom to raise children and live safe from violence. Indigenous women and girls face violence and discrimination not only because we're women, but also because of our indigeneity. Rooted in hundreds of years of colonial beliefs, attitudes, and actions that continue today, Indigenous women and girls face disproportionate amounts of male violence, yet the violence is rarely named as such. The issue of male violence against Indigenous women and girls, including the hundreds of murders, hundreds or thousands of murders and disappearances, is not an Indigenous issue. This is a Canadian issue and a feminist issue, and one that must be looked at with an Indigenous feminist lens, and one that must be addressed in conjunction with violence against women and girls more generally, in a context of patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism. Violence against women and girls doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is interconnected with issues of poverty, homelessness, colonialism, capitalism, the sex industry, imperialism, environmental destruction, poor immigration policy, issues of disability and aging, overcriminalization, lack of childcare, and disproportionate rates of child apprehension by the foster care system for Indigenous women and girls, and many other issues that work together to disproportionately harm and attempt to control women and girls. None of this is inevitable. We can work towards safety and freedom for women and girls and a redefinition of masculinity from one that is violent to one that is kind and loving. All levels of government and the criminal justice system can hold men accountable for the violence they perpetrate against women and girls. We're all a part of this issue, whether we think we are or not, and we can all, as individuals and as governments, be part of the solution.
Thank you so much, Terry. Having just heard those disturbing facts, a question for our candidates, beginning this time with Lisa Barrett. How will your party ensure that female victims of domestic violence have access to appropriate services, both from women's shelters and the justice system?
Well, I think that the main way that we can go about this is to live up to our obligations under the international law and our commitments to the United Nations and to CEDAW. And what I referred to before, the report showing how we are not living up to those obligations, I think it's very important for us to wake up and pay attention to how far behind Canada has fallen in terms of protecting our women and children. In the March 15th report from United Nations Human Rights Office of High Commissioner, they said that the committee concludes there's been a grave violation of rights under CEDAW. Canada has therefore violated a number of articles of the Convention, including the obligation to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women, the right to equal protection before the law, an effective remedy, the obligation of states to combat and eliminate harmful stereotypes, which I think speaks partly to what Sherry was just talking about, and the right of Aboriginal women to enjoy adequate living conditions on and off reserves, and I would add that that should be safe living conditions on and off reserve. We need to go to the Indian Act as well, a piece of legislation that is long overdue to be repealed. The Indian Act has done so much harm for generations and generations. That has to go.
Thank you. Hetty Fry?
I think we're talking here about violence against women and what you would do. And I think I said earlier,
Address women's shelters and the justice system, because those were some of the issues that Cherry raised.
because I think that it's really important to bring in women's shelters. We had brought in women's shelters at one point in time and invested in first and second stage housing for women. But that has gone by the wayside in the last 10 years. I don't think there are women's shelters anymore that are safe and secure for women. Women can't be in shelters with other men, especially if they're fleeing violence. But I wanted to talk about something that I think not just about shelters. I think it's time that we looked at public awareness programs. In Australia, when I visited there at one time, what they were doing is they had men who were sports stars and movie stars and very important men who were standing up and doing ads that were saying, this is not cool, man. You know, you just don't beat a woman. That is not an appropriate thing. And that kind of stuff, when men hear it from their heroes, it tells them that it's not acceptable. There's zero tolerance for this kind of thing. So we need to look at, amongst programs, bring about these kinds of programs that increase public awareness for young boys and for men, that this is not cool, that this is not the way to go. It actually played a major role in bringing down some of the violence against women in Australia. So I think we need to look at that, and we need to look at supportive programs to make sure that women also have, when they escape and they go into shelter, that we have justice for the men who have been beating them or stalking them or whatever. They have access to that justice so that they can be safe to go back out into the world and remake their lives. And that is a key part, because going back into the world and remaking your lives, as a physician, I can tell you, it's very difficult for a lot of my patients whose husbands continued and partners continued to stalk them forever.
Thank you, Hetty. In terms of galvanizing male support for an anti-violence message, you heard that Wayne Gretzky has come out in favor of Stephen Harper just a few days ago. And Constance Barnes. What specifically would
that was an interesting nugget of information. I'm like, okay, follow that. So I would say I would definitely bring up the housing strategy. Tom Mulcair and the NDP has made it very clear that what we will not allow is for women to go without housing, and we never want to turn women away from a shelter. So we need to build more shelters. We need to make sure that there's affordable, accessible housing, and we need to make sure that women are safe. I am going to now speak about the Aboriginal women, and one of the things that the NDP will do within the first 100 days of being elected, we will make sure there is an inquiry to the murdered and missing women that have gone, because what we know for a fact is that I appreciate you brought up CEDAW, because it's amazing that United Nations CEDAW had to come into Canada to do the work that the federal government should have done, as far as making sure that our women and our Aboriginal peoples are safe. So shame on us for not taking responsibility for our own women. And it breaks my heart to know that the First Nations women are living in third world poverty in this country, in Canada. They are subject to the worst violence in the world. So the system is flawed. There's no accountability. We have not been doing our job. And again, housing and safety is a huge piece of this. So we need to maintain the affordable housing we have, and we need to make sure that we have shelters for every woman and her little ones to go to. And that's what we have promised within our housing strategy.
And lastly, Hetty. So our next question is, what concrete actions will your party take in working towards eliminating violence against Indigenous women and girls?
I think the most important thing is to work with Indigenous women and girls to be able to deal with this issue. We cannot leave women, Indigenous women, out of the debate. We cannot have them not make decisions, because what happens is that if we go around imposing what we think are great answers and great solutions, we miss the mark every time. So that's the first piece. I also think that I learned a lot when I chaired a committee, all-party committee, that traveled around and talked to Indigenous women and girls. And I think there are no shelters on reserve. And a reserve is a small place, and the woman is trying to find shelter, and of course, the person who is inflicting the violence is living there. So women leave the reserve, and they come into the cities where they get less money than non-Indigenous women in terms of welfare. Family agencies in the provinces pick them up, take their children away from them. More children are taken out of Aboriginal women in urban areas and put into care than they did during the residential schools. Right now, that's happening here. So there are a whole lot of things that we need to do to change that. We cannot have that, but we need Aboriginal women to help us to understand a very culturally sensitive way in which the Aboriginal people's culture and their traditions, etc., can come to play in helping them to create some sort of solution to the problems that is made by them and for them.
Thank you. Constance, what concrete actions would the NDP take to eliminate violence against Indigenous women and girls?
So I would say the very first thing that we would do is the investigation into the murdered and missing women. Because without that, there is no trust. There is no belief in the system. And until we have accountability, and I don't mean to be rude or assuming, but I'm telling you, if these were Caucasian or white women, there is no way that this would have gone as far as it has. There is no way that we would be even having this discussion. So this is about racism. This is about pushing people aside. This is about not wanting to address the issue. And until we take it with respect and look at what has happened in the past and address it, and the year of reconciliation, I know at the Park Board, we had amazing discussions with our First Nations people as to what we were going to do with green space, blue space, every tree and bush that had meaning. We have lost that, and we have lost our way in Canada. There is a reason that this has been pushed aside. We need to address that first so that we have trust. We need to build trust before we can move forward, in my opinion. And that's why within the first 100 days, we will have the national inquiry into the murdered and missing women.
Thank you very much. We're about to take questions from the audience after we hear concluding remarks. So again, if we could... Erica? Oh my God, I am so very, very sorry, Lisa. I'm working it for you. You know what, I'm just
It's your gorgeous hair. Nobody can see you behind your gorgeous hair.
That's right. Oh no, now we're talking hair. This is really bad.
There's a lot of rain today. It's bigger.
Okay, Lisa Barrett of the Green Party, what concrete actions would you take to eliminate violence against Indigenous women?
Well, I have to concur that the first thing we have to do is have that independent investigation into the murdered and missing women. It's a total no-brainer. We need this, and we already know from the Commission of Inquiry. We know what the underlying problems are, but we still have women on the Highway of Tears who cannot get a bus because there aren't buses that run between communities there. They're forced out in the street to hitchhike. They're vulnerable. We know what some of the immediate answers can be. We're just not applying those. We need to repeal the Indian Act, but if that's the choice of the First Nations people across this country. But we also have to pay attention to the fact that, especially here in British Columbia, but in other places across this country, we are on unceded land. We are talking about people who have never surrendered their inherent rights to this place. And to have people who are the original people living in apartheid state kind of qualities of life, it's just It's a scandal. But I just want to go back to CEDAW again. So here's what they say as part of the preambular language, emphasizing that the eradication of apartheid in all forms of racism, racial discrimination, sorry, Erica, colonialism, neocolonialism, aggression, foreign occupation, and domination and interference in the internal affairs of states is essential to the full enjoyment of rights of men and women. So I think we need to pay close attention to the kind of obligations that we have to live up to. And we've already signed these documents. Now we've just got to implement them.
Thank you very much. We've heard from all three. And we know that we have asked you to address a lot in a very short time, but we also know you're political candidates, so you are always perhaps willing to share a little bit more about what your party would do should it form the next government. So each of you now has 2.5 minutes for your closing remarks. And keeping the order as we have, let's start with Constance Barnes of the NDP for closing remarks.
Well, it's a lot to take in. It's a lot to take in. I know I'm going to speak for myself. I would say that, you know, my history is deep and long, and being a feminist is something my mother fought long and hard for. 4 daughters. My dad, who was Emery Barnes, who was a heck of a activist as well, was always out there fighting the fight. It's in me. It's in me. It's going nowhere. And he had 4 girls, and I'll tell you, he had me out there with the chainsaw and with all the power tools and everything else. So I can work it like any guy that would be out there building that house. That being said, I'm honored to be a candidate. I'm honored to be sitting here on a panel with women. I'm honored that we have 4 women in this riding running to be members of Parliament. It's huge. It's huge. I'm honored that I'm sitting here with women of color. I would like to see some LGBTQ and trans people up here at some point that I'm able to get up and support as well. I think that the NDP have a great platform. I love the housing. I love the pieces on early care and learning, the $15 an hour wage. The fact that we are looking at dropping the corporate, raising the corporate tax rate 2% so that we can use those dollars for the programs that we're talking about tonight, the shelters and the women and the people that need the help. Continuing with a really good housing plan, looking at the pieces that maybe we don't need to be spending a huge amount of money on, which is the shared income, and looking at why is it that 15% of our population get a tax break. We're not supporting that, but we do want to make sure that the shared income is there for seniors. So those are the kinds of things that we're looking at. I think, in a nutshell, for me, is the NDP are very grassroots. We work hard. We fight hard. We are here for the people. As my dad always used to say, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So for me, I'm hoping to be part of the solution. I will continue to be there and be the voice for the people that do not have a voice. And I'm honored to be a candidate running in this election. It's going to be a tight one, but it's going to be a good race. And I think it's really, really time for change in this country. We can't risk another 4 years of Harper. Thank you.
Thank you, Constance. Closing remarks from Lisa Barrett of the Green Party.
Thank you, Erica. Well, you've already heard about our guaranteed livable income, and we believe that that is one of the strongest policies and the most progressive policies being put forward by any party in Canada right now. We're going to look at funding that by stripping out the public subsidies that those poor foreign oil and gas companies are receiving in the tune of billions and billions of dollars for the tar sands, for the fracking, for the pipelines. These things can be on their own for, maybe 5 or 6 years, I bet, but they're going to miss those subsidies and they'll be shutting those suckers down pretty soon. While they keep pumping that stuff out, though, we propose a fee and dividend, a carbon fee and dividend on the kind of carbon products that are exacerbating climate change and making life a lot worse for many of us. When you look at the people who are being burned out of their homes, the extreme weather, climate change is costing us a lot more than it would cost us to stop what we're doing and do things differently. We plan to invest that in an infrastructure program, a retrofit program, so that we rebuild homes in ways that are sustainable. We plan to, as I said, have tuition-free post-secondary education by 2020, and we will have a workforce of very well-educated young people, maybe even older people, who will go back to school. And we plan to have a national pharmacare program, because there is no darn reason, except for the trade agreements that do not want us. These investor-state trade agreements are fighting the kind of program, like a national pharmacare program, tooth and nail, supply management programs as well. So when you hear other parties talking about how they're not anti-business, but they are pro-trade, it's not about trade. This is about the sellout of our sovereignty, and we need to pay attention because it's happening fast. We've already got the China-Canada Foreign Investor Protection Act. The name says it all. It protects those foreign investors. So far, I think the Green Party is the only party that is objecting to that. So please, please pay attention. It's very important, and it's important right now.
And lastly, let's hear from Hedy Fry of the Liberal Party of Canada.
We've talked a lot about what needs to be done. I don't think that anybody here argues about what needs to be done. We know what needs to be done. We've known what needed to be done to give women equality, not only here in Canada, but around the world. The thing about it is political will. We need to have the political will to do it. But we also need to have the money to put in all of these programs and these initiatives we're talking about. And you cannot have money to do these things if it's cuts and austerity, if we've seen in the last 10 years, and if, in fact, we're talking about balancing budgets in 6 weeks and in 6 months and in a year. The time is to invest in people, to invest in women, to invest in men, to invest in jobs, to invest in growth. A deficit is not the end of the world, and we're saying we are not going to go into we're going to go into deficit for 3 years, and then we're going to balance budget. But we need to attack these things now. To do so, we need to have the money, to put the money where your mouth is, to get those programs done, to get that housing built, to get all of these things we talked about here. And I think this is something we should do. We need to do research. We need to do a lot of research on women and men. We need to bring back the long-form census so we know where women are and men are in terms of society. We need to be able to talk about research. It's not just done in an academic setting, but there was a time in the 1990s when we had research being done by universities in combination with NGOs who knew the reality of a life on the ground. And, I always call it in vitro, which is what you do in the academic sector, and in vivo, which is what you do in the real life. Those two come together, we make good decisions. And we need to engage as governments back again with women, NGOs, civil society, work with them as partners. And that has to be a real political will to be able to do that. And so these are some of the things. So we can talk as much as we like about what we think should be done and if you don't get it done, if you don't have the political will and the money, and if you don't make the right choices to get that money to do those things, we continue to cut, and the women are the ones who suffer the most. Now, I just want to say one last thing about Indigenous women. I think we know that Indigenous women are where they are now, and all Indigenous peoples, because of colonialization, because of all that has happened to them. It's a systemic racism, it's a systemic problem. We're not going to cut through that problem alone. We have to work with Indigenous women. In 1997, I went to Santiago, and I brought forward the idea that Indigenous peoples were peoples and not population groups. And that was accepted by the United Nations. And now we need to ratify that rights of Indigenous peoples in the United Nations that Canada had a big role in playing. We need to get it done, ratified, make it happen. Let's not talk anymore, guys. Let's get the thing done.
Okay, thank you very much. They can all take 15 minutes per question. Thank you so much to our political candidates and as well to our panelists for coming tonight and for speaking out and sharing your thoughts with us. And now it's your turn. We've got about 25 minutes left for a question and answer. I see 2 microphones here. People will be circulating through the audience. If somebody has a question, just raise your hand and we'll get right to it.
I just want to go back to talking about the form of violence against women, that is prostitution. We have a great start to dealing with prostitution in Bill 36, going after the demand for paid sexual access to women and children's bodies. I'm interested in hearing how your party will be forcing police forces and municipalities to actually take that piece of legislation apart and enact it, and what will you be doing to help fund exiting services and the resources women need to leave prostitution?
And to whom would you like to address this question first?
All of them.
Okay. So would one of you like to take it?
I'd like to start. I'm going to say categorically that my party will not pass Bill C-36. We think that it harms... But if we get back, we will repeal it because it does not comply with the Supreme Court ruling and the Bedford decision. It puts women who are on the street in very precarious positions. They're in harm's way. We have got to make sure that we protect women first and foremost. And we can't pick and choose which women we protect. We cannot do that. And so we know that a lot of women who are out there on the street are out there on the street because they're being exploited, because they're poor, because they're indigenous, because they're racialized, and we need to be able to protect them. And that law does not protect them, and so we don't bite. You asked the question, I'm giving you my answer. Okay, the second thing I think that we need to do, as you said, is to have resources to help women who wish to exit to be able to exit. We need to have a strong addiction strategy that does not treat people who are addicted as if they are criminals, but we need to be able to look at addictions as a medical problem. And a lot of women who are in the sex trade are actually women who have been run into it because they keep feeding the addictions of these women and make them go out to work in order to give them the drugs that they need. This is not an easy answer, but I still think at the beginning we have to protect all women in this country, not the ones that we think we like what they do or don't do. We either protect all women or we don't.
Thank you very much. Would either of the other candidates like to weigh in?
I will just speak, excuse me, I just had a really great meeting with Wish last week, and we had a really superb discussion on this. So all I'm going to say is what our party's plan is to make sure women are safe. These are decisions of the women. And these are decisions that for us, we need to make sure that we're there to make sure that women and children are safe.
I would invite you to meet with my group, which is prostituted women as well.
Okay.
We all have history in prostitution, and we fully support those.
I would love to, you know what, I'll get your information afterwards and we'll have a discussion. That would be great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the question.
Thank you. And Lisa?
Well, I would just echo some of what Hetty was saying, and it disturbs me that there are serious aspects or problems with C-36 that perpetuate this trend that we keep seeing of criminalization of poverty, criminalization of the most vulnerable people, where what the federal government should be doing is not legislating against those people who most need their help. They should be setting up the programs and not cutting the programs through their austerity program, setting up programs as we know and we find out when something comes to the Supreme Court, we know there's a serious problem the court is being asked to address. We have to go back and refund status of women, get the researchers to tell the politicians exactly what has to be done, not recriminalize people over and over and over again.
Thank you very much. And I think just going in order, we'll start in the back, if you don't mind, and we'll get to you. And if I could ask the questions to be contained and also 1 minute for the political candidates' responses. Thank you.
Picking up on Hetty and Aglika, I would like to ask whether you'll put an intersectional, not just a gender, but intersectional lens on policy program funding. Specifically, will you fund a national comprehensive housing program? And will you support proportional representation? And finally, will you fully fund the Status of Women Canada and include education advocacy and fund a national action organization for women?
That was directed to me, Ellen, right? I just wanted to say that absolutely, getting back and funding women's organizations, because I know when I was a minister, it was always great when women's organizations gave me hell, because I could go to cabinet and say, geez, you know, hey guys, I'm getting like hell from these women. You got to listen. Here's what they're saying, and here's what they're doing. It helped me to push agenda forward quite a lot. So that symbiotic relationship between NGOs and women's NGOs is a really important one for government to keep our feet to the fire and to push us and to push those who don't understand. And although I hated the NAC lobby, I got to tell you, we had a NAC lobby, and I got all my colleagues in cabinet to come to it. Now, you asked a question about
proportional representation and the National Housing Program.
This is something that my leader is committed to, proportional representation. What he isn't committed to is what kind. As you know, there are about 4 or 5 kinds of proportional representation. He's going to set up, as soon as he becomes Prime Minister, a all-party parliamentary body to go around and to check out with Canadians which one of those proportional representation models that they like. I personally like the Australian model, but I know people will like it. Then he will implement it. So proportional representation is definitely on our agenda, and we have a huge policy platform on changing Parliament and changing the way we vote and changing the way democracy operates in this country.
Thank you, Hetty. That's a bit of a tricky question because it's three-pronged, so it's difficult to answer in a minute. But Constance, if you could weigh in, National Housing Program, proportional representation, and better funding for the status of women so they can adequately
National Housing,
support
Ellen,
women's
yes.
Hi, Ellen. Good to see you. The National Housing Strategy I've already talked about, so the answer to that is yes. Yes to proportional representation. We know that actually for my Green candidate here, the next time around, that's the way you want to go. That's the way to do it, is to go with the proportional representation, get NDP in now so that we make that change. I know you're not. I know you're not. And I'm sorry, the last
Status of women
piece,
funding.
Status of women, absolutely, absolutely. So yes, yes, and yes.
All right, and Lisa
I'll
Barron.
keep it short.
Okay, so I've already talked about the National Housing Program, absolutely, and the Green Party is putting housing first, rather like the Four Pillars approach. So what we really want to do is get the homeless and the people who are most at risk into homes as soon as possible. It's triage, we get people off the streets and into safe, appropriate housing. The second part was program, of course, we support that, but we don't want to impose a proportional representation system. We propose that there be a commission that goes across Canada consulting. There's a novel idea. And I think that participatory democracy is the best form of democracy. So we would seek out what would be the best form of proportional representation for Canada, much like the Citizens' Assembly did here in BC. Status of women, I've talked about already, absolutely. Refund it, build it up, bring back NAC.
Thank you very much. And there's a question in the front. Gwen?
I'd like to ask the question of the NDP, what level of support or what kind of commitment you can make to funding the women's NGOs. The advocacy voice of the women is really important. We know that core funding has been cut for so many organizations. Many have disappeared. Many of them are really in a great deal of trouble. Almost all of them have been told that they won't be funded to do any advocacy work, some service work, fine, under the control of a government, fine, but not advocacy work, not the kind of holding government to account work that Hetty is talking about, and that NAC did, and NOL did, and that FAFIA is trying to do. You all have great positions on a number of things, but if you get into power, you will have the experience of having to deal with contending forces, and you will need an empowered women's movement to hold your government's feet to the fire.
I had to give a red card to the questioner.
I would say that we absolutely, we support, no, that's okay. We support everything that you have just said. And we have 43% of women candidates right now. You saw the graph, more than any other party. We have more women running, and Indigenous women and women across the board. So we have that strength within the party to make sure and hold, Mr. Mulcair and the party to the fire. So we will absolutely move forward with all of what you were talking about. I think advocacy is huge. The programming is huge that you're talking about, but also having the understanding and the professionalism and the history. I mean, I'm not going to say it's not rocket science, but you can look at the work that's been done before, and many times it's reinstating what has been taken away. And under the Harper Conservatives, a lot of this has been taken away. It's not top of mind for them. We know it's not a priority. So for us, it's looking at what we can do to bring back what has been taken away, to make sure that we have strength in women and strength in numbers, to make sure those programs go forward.
Thank you very much. Question in the back.
So many people in this room will know that since 2011 we've been building a childcare movement with a plan in this province called the $10 a day childcare plan. And so I'd like to hear from each of the three candidates. It can be a brief answer. In BC we've now got supporters that represent 2 million residents here. So I'd like to know from each of you, speaking for your parties, will you commit to federal transfer payments that are specifically earmarked for childcare, the timelines, the benchmarks for establishing more investment in childcare, so that we can implement the $10 a day childcare plan in this province?
Let's start with Lisa Barrett.
Yes, I talked about this earlier, and definitely the Green Party is looking at working with provincial governments and local governments to ensure that there is childcare available, that it's affordable, that hopefully will be $10 a day. But I think that it requires working all across Canada to make sure it's universally available, not just in British Columbia. But certainly we would be working with British Columbians to deliver that kind of service.
And just specifically, does your party support earmarking transfer payments?
Yes,
for
definitely
childcare?
earmarking the transfer payments and additionally providing tax credits for those workplaces that would provide on-site childcare.
Can I just clarify that the $10 a day childcare plan is not one size fits all. It has built-in expansion to accommodate shift work.
Great. Constance?
Yes, so, I mean, hi, Sharon. Yes, yes. Sharon and I have worked on this. She was actually, I would say, my mentor when I got on the Vancouver Park Board and was told that childcare was not something that the Park Board did. And I took that on, and we ended up passing a motion at the Vancouver Park Board to make sure that every single community centre had affordable, accessible childcare, and we worked diligently on that. So I thank you, Sharon Gregson, for getting me on board and working with me on that. But yes, and I'm sorry, I don't have the exact. It was over 20,000 spaces that we were looking at putting in. I don't believe it was by the end of the year, so I don't have an actual timeline. But our goal is to make sure the $15 a day daycare is in place as soon as possible and make sure that across the country we have affordable, accessible childcare for all of Canadians.
And as part of that, earmarking some of the transfer payments specifically for childcare?
Absolutely.
Because that was done away with, I believe, in 1995 under Paul Martin.
It was taken out. It was taken away. Yes, and it will be replaced with even more. And I'm sorry, I don't have that exact number. I should have it rolling off my tongue by now, Sharon. But it is a fair sum, and it's specific for childcare.
Thank you. And Hetty Fry.
Well, you just mentioned that in 2004, it took us about 4 years to negotiate with provinces and territories to have an earmarked $5 billion towards childcare that is flexible. But there are 4 components. It's not just childcare. It's not just about looking after children. It is about quality, universal, accessible, and developmental. It has to be about early learning and early childhood development. And we need to be able, part of our plan was to value childcare workers so that they got certified, they got a clear ability to do the kind of developmental work that is really, really important in childcare. So that kind of dedicated fund is absolutely there. We're bringing it back if we form government. But I just wanted to say what saddens me most, and I don't want to get completely negative about this, what saddens me is that we have that signed with the provinces, ready to go in 2005, and the NDP did not support it. We would have been in the 10th year of a national childcare quad program at this time.
So I'll just make the comment that the reason we didn't support it is because the money was coming out of pensions. It was coming out of a line item that had nothing to do with childcare.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question from the audience.
Huge surpluses in those days.
So in terms of order, who's next? It's difficult to see. You, sir.
I just wanted to say there's so much to say after everything that was said tonight, so thank you very much for everything. I think that in order to have this equality, we need to empower women, and I'm really happy to hear the focus towards shelter and health. And when I say health, I mean control over reproduction, just something that is so often taken away. The question I have is actually directed at each of you individually. And it's sort of I'd love it if you can answer it in as few words as possible. If you are elected, what will you do to set a great example for other young women as well as young men to see women in a leadership role? But more importantly, what will you do if you're not elected?
Well, before I was elected, I mentored a lot of young women, and I took a leadership role because I don't know if most people see me, they think I'm a physician, they think all is well. I grew up in social housing. My parents were poor. My father and mother were grade 8 education. They did not have, were not able to do much, but they helped me to get a good education. And as a result, they gave up a house to send me off to do medicine. They took all their savings to do that. So I get it. I understand what it was like to be there. I understand the struggle. I understand how important education has to play for a role for women moving forward, access, equal opportunity for women to be able to get a good education, to be able to get skills and training, move forward and be independent. And my mentorship for women has always been, my father always said to me, he said, I want you to get a good education, get a good job so that no guy can push you around. And if you want to walk away, you can walk away because you have the ability to bring up yourself and your children. And women must remember that, and women must know that. And we as a government have a role to play in getting them that opportunity to be able to get there.
Just briefly, because you do have 10 seconds, but could you give us some specifics in terms of examples that how you would give young women good leadership examples? I mean, you said you're committed, but could you be specific?
Well, I like to think that as an MP for most of my time, I have been a role model for many women, not just women, but women of color, or marginalized women. I like to think that it was Canada who took to Beijing the idea of the diversity of women, including LGBTQ women, women who broke down all the sort of diversity. We felt it wasn't simple to just look at women as an amorphous mass. So that's what I have done. That is what I will continue.
Okay, thank you very much. Constance?
So you asked me to keep it short. I will be honest, be accessible, be available to any woman, young woman, or kidlet that wants to talk. And that's what I do now. I do lots of speaking engagements, and I'm there, and if somebody picks up the phone and needs to chat, I'm there. And I think transparency and honesty is a big one. If I don't win in the election, I will be transparent, I will be honest, I will be accessible, and I will be there. And to end, I would say I will continue to tell my story, because the more I talk about the reality of what I have been through and go through, I still to this day work an incredible program. I have 6.5 years of sobriety. So I'm very honest and open about that as well. And it has given me an opportunity to now be an executive on Avalon Women's Society. So I work with women in addiction as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Constance. And Lisa?
Well, I guess I have to admit that I'm not really comfortable with the concept of leader or leadership. And so evading that part of your question, I used to have a bumper sticker on what we called the mayor-mobile. So I was 6 years as a mayor, and I drove around with this thing that said, "There they go. I must chase after them, for I am their leader." And I think that's important. You have to be with people to know where you should be going. You have to understand, and that's where the participatory democracy comes in. You have to make that space for participation. You have to have the invitation so that people will feel comfortable to participate in that process. So you don't have leadership, you have people who are sharing decision-making in a real life situation. And I think there's no reason why we can't do that. Democracy doesn't happen once every 4 years. It should be every day, and that's where we should be doing it.
Thank you. Next question. Oh, I'm sorry, just going in order with the microphone and then.
Hello, so my name is Frances Emmanuel Jolie. I'm with the Vancouver Women's Health Collective, so it will come as no surprise to you that I'm going to ask a question about health. And I'm perfectly aware that is layers of jurisdiction that will probably factor into your answers. But we all know that access to health for women can be a little bit challenged sometimes. And if we talk about young women, we can talk about contraception, we can talk about saving the right for abortion so that women can have choices. And we were talking a lot about women leaving Aboriginal communities because they're not safe, but we could also talk about access to health in remote communities. And so I would like to know if you could specifically address what your parties will do in terms of improving healthcare and health specifically for women.
In remote communities or just in general?
In general, with an accent on remote communities. Thank you.
Okay. I think we should start with Lisa this time.
Well, I do know that the province of British Columbia, at any rate, is focusing the training of doctors to encourage doctors to go into remote and rural communities and other health practitioners. That's at the provincial level. I think at the federal level, we have to pay attention to the fact that the Canada Health Accord is not being renewed. And I think that's very important. I don't know how many Canadians don't know that, but when we're talking about the transfer payments not being earmarked, well, this is an earmarked transfer payment and a commitment, and it's been cut. It has been stopped. You know, they may say it's just not renewed, and that just sounds so pleasant, like you didn't renew your library book. This is a serious issue, and I think that it's something that we have to address immediately, and the Green Party is prepared to do that.
So a national healthcare strategy, which includes rolling back pensions from 67 to 65, making sure that, excuse me, we have more doctors. The hospitals need to be looked at. The infrastructure needs to be looked at. Also, we have had a really interesting announcement and discussion on Alzheimer's and dementia. So looking at a strategy that works not so much on prevention, but acknowledgement of what can be done, the science that is working with people with Alzheimer's and dementia. An amazing amount of work done on youth and children. We know that we have obese children, children with diabetes, making sure that that is being addressed. But really having an overall strategy. One of the ones I really like is looking at pharmaceuticals and buying pharmaceuticals in bulk as opposed to buying them from the companies and paying huge amounts of dollars so that they are affordable and accessible for our seniors and our retirees and our veterans and people that are struggling between buying their pharmaceuticals or their housing or food. So, and that's all encompassed in the medical strategy.
Thank you. And lastly, Hetty, healthcare, you might have.
Well, the first thing we
dabbled in.
need to do in healthcare is to actually correct the fiscal imbalance that occurred as a result of Stephen Harper imposing on provinces that per capita transfer. Because what it has done is it's not allowed all of the provinces to be equal, and it hasn't paid attention to what you're talking about, which are the demographics and the geographical differences that create an inaccessibility to healthcare. So we need to correct that. We need to look at what provinces need in order to give them that ability to create universal accessible healthcare once again. We're going to have to save Medicare. And to do that, we're going to have to sit down, and that's the first thing we're doing. And I don't know if you saw Justin Trudeau's letter to the Premier saying that healthcare was one of the core things he wanted to talk to them. We've got to change the way we deliver healthcare as well, because we have a lot of chronic illnesses, and we need to be able to look at healthcare not only being about a hospital and a doctor. We need to shift the care into communities, into community care clinics with multidisciplinary teams. Somewhere in the north, we might be able to use nurse practitioners. We need to take technology to be able to allow people in rural and remote areas to be able to have access to tertiary care in places like UBC. So those are all of the things we plan to do, and it's about looking at the transformative change that's necessary that was hoped for in 2004 and that never really happened because these guys walked away from it in 2006.
Thank you very much. I'm mindful of the time. It is 8:59, and we promised people could get out at 9, but there still are lots of folks with questions. So 2 more? 3? Is everyone good for 3 more? Can we all stay longer?
I have 1 minute.
You have 1 minute. Okay.
As a woman, you should all know that. I need to go to the washroom. I've been guzzling lots of water here. But secondly, I have another event I have to go to.
Okay, so we can squeeze in one last question, and you have the mic.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I'm a member of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, and so... Oh, okay, yes. And so it will come as no surprise to you that this will be a union-focused question. It is well known that in countries that have strong unions, that women benefit in terms of pay and benefits. It is well known that within unions, women prosper because, again, there's the fight for equality, pay equity, for benefits, for pensions, and so on, and specifically things such as sick leave. I would like to know from each of the candidates, given the gutting within the last horrible omnibus bills of the unions and Lisa Rait's enjoyment of back to work legislation for any union that sort of wants to exercise its rights. From each party, can you please let us know what you're going to do to strengthen unions and continue the fight for?
And I think we should start off with Hetty this time.
I think unions are absolutely essential for employment equity, pay equity. I wish unions would do more to push for pay equity and make it actually happen so that we don't have these ghettos of some jobs that we don't value enough that women do, that we say because women do it, it's invaluable. I mean, that was the root causes of pay equity problems in the beginning, because we made certain jobs so run by women pay less because they were run by women, and we got to narrow that gap. But we know that unions are a strong part of a society that allows for workers to be able to get equal access, equality of benefits, and equality of proper work environment, and to be able to help unions, to help workers to have their rights acknowledged around the world, and not only around the world, but here in Canada. So we've always supported unions. We will continue to support unions, and that's my answer to that question.
Thank you. Constance.
So, yeah, the NDP and unions kind of go hand in hand. So if we are elected, we will absolutely do everything we can to support you, as well as get the postal workers back so that they're delivering door to door, because that's a huge piece too. And we had a great meeting with the union workers that were out there, and we need to make sure that they're able to do their job as well. I'd actually like to talk to you a little bit more and get your contact afterwards. So I have a couple of ideas. Thanks very much for the question.
And Lisa Barrett.
Well, as an activist, I would have to say, as a labor activist, I worry about being put on the watch list, being put on the terrorist watch list because of Bill C-51, and the Green Party is committed to repealing Bill C-51 as soon as possible. And right after that, repeal all of the anti-union legislation that's been bundled up.
All right, thank you very much. That concludes our evening. I just want to give a big thank you. We have a goodbye from the organizers, so don't go just yet. Thank you so much to our panelists, to our political candidates. I know you're both all very busy. You're taking off for future events. We really appreciate you taking the time. And now, please join me in welcoming Vivica Ellis, who is co-founder of the Mothers Alliance of BC. And the coordinating collective.
I know it's after 9 o'clock. Everyone's eager to go home. I just wanted to say this is actually the entire coordinating committee, missing Najia, who we think is still in Morocco. So they all wanted to come up with me, and thank you all. So on behalf of the SSMA, we would like to thank our brilliant panelists, Sheila, Iglika, Cherry, and Grace, our inspiring party representatives, Constance, Jody, and Lisa, and our amazing, fantastic mediator, Erica, for making this night great. This event was a very collaborative process. We organized this together. We were a real team. A special thank you goes out to Margot Young for her ongoing consulting and support, Paige McKenzie of the Canadian Women Voters Congress, Equal Voice, Shannon Dobe of the CCPA, Anastasia and Miriam of the Up for Debate campaign in BC, Vancouver Rape Relief, Am Jo Hall, Andrea, Lucia, and the rest of the team at the Vancity Office of Community Engagement, which allowed a grassroots organization, community-based group of feminist activists like us to pull off an event like this. They fully supported this. It didn't cost us a penny, and we were able to spend our dollars on printer paper and childcare to keep up our community organizing. So this event was organized entirely by single mother volunteers, and if you have it in you to support us this evening, we have donation baskets at the back of the room. And like I said, every dollar helps us keep our organization alive. It's unfortunate that decade after decade we have to keep up this activism, but we're hoping that we're going to elect a strong base of feminists, send them to Ottawa, keep that campaign going. So thank you very much, and don't forget everybody to vote.
Thank you.